The sound of coins clinked in the air. Nemel opened a groggy eye.
What time was it?
The shutters were half open, offering a view of shrouded peaks in the grey light. She had slept in again.
It's because of that magic item. No, it was more than that.
The magic item that regulated the temperature of the surroundings did remind Nemel of the humble, yet cozy comfort of Grand Manor, but there was something else.
Something strange.
It was a feeling she never had before and she couldn't think of a good word to describe it. The feeling suffused her entire being, a light sensation that drifted just outside of her direct awareness. More than something, it was somewhere. A piece of herself that had been missing for her entire life, a place where she belonged. This feeling of belonging wasn't in the familial sense. Nemel had grown up in a loving family who did what they could for their youngest daughter. This was more purposeful, more assertive, something that instilled her with a greater sense of direction and confidence than she had before. Coins continued to clink against each other. Nemel slowly sat up. She drew her blanket around her in a bid to savor its receding warmth.
Good morning, Miss Gran.
Good morning, Dame Verilyn. Nemel lowered her head. As she did, she smiled over the fact that it wasn't out of ingrained habit.
Have a new liege now.
I'm going to have a real title with a fief and... She frowned as her line of thought hit a snag. Dame Verilyn was a knight, but what was a vassal of a knight called? Not that Dame Verilyn was just any old knight. The territory she held was the size of a large barony, and Baroness Saradnik in turn had a barony the size of a large county. Frontier lands were often weird like that, as borders could be in flux, and it was one of the duties of a frontier noble to expand when they could. In the Empire, this was considered the old way of things, as nobles no longer bore martial obligations as a part of the contract with their liege. Many of their traditions and customs had been carried into the imperial army, but one could not take the forces under their command out to conquer more land for themselves. The Sorceress Kingdom was not the Empire, however, and they followed the old way of things as they had adopted the laws of Reastais. Nemel shook her head. None of that helped her figure out just what sort of noble she was. Unless there were some bizarre circumstances involved, a vassal of the gentry was not a member of the nobility.
Are you unwell? Dame Verilyn's voice drifted over her.
No, I'm fine, Nemel replied. I'm feeling great, actually. It's strange, I went to bed last night and everything just felt right when I woke up.
Ah, Dame Verilyn nodded.
That. You'll get used to it after a while, enough that you'll no longer notice that it's there.
You know what it is?
Dame Verilyn took a stack of 10 gold coins and set it beside another. She reached into a purse on the table and started on the next, seemingly taking her time to slowly savor the activity. It's an ability, she said. One possessed by Lord-type beings. Nemel's mouth fell open as she clutched her blanket. You're a dragon lord? The frost dragon in elven form seemed to find her question amusing.
Not yet,
she smirked. In draconic culture, one must either be an ancient or possess some extraordinary quality to be considered a lord. Check with me again in 300 years.
But I'll be dead.
Will you? If that happens to be the case, tell your children to do so in 300 years. If you're wondering where the effect is coming from, it's provided by my liege. You are, by extension, one of her subjects.
I thought you said Baroness Saradnik was a noble, Nemel said.
And I said that nobles were human lords, Dame Verilyn added. Every race has lords, though the specific functions that they serve vary from species to species. The abilities of lord-type individuals depend on factors that include their race's natural characteristics and cultural development. In their most raw form, lords have abilities and skills that supplement the strengths or shore up the weaknesses of their race. As a professional soldier, or at least a professional soldier in training, Nemel had been instructed on the lord-type demi-humans that Imperial Army patrols might encounter. This knowledge was fairly limited, however, essentially paraphrased as kill that one first. Most were considered the rough equivalent to commanders, or more accurately captains, and were profiled with the accordingly appropriate threat assessment. That humans had leader types similar to demi-human lords was stupidly clear in hindsight, especially since they commonly equated demi-human lords with commanders. It was a strange thing to not realize, or maybe it was just Nemel that never realized it. I know martial nobles do extremely well as officers in the army, Nemel said, but House Grand doesn't have a martial tradition. We're just wizards. Blasting people with fireballs sounds overwhelmingly martial to me. If your family has been one long line of aristocratic wizards, however, I would venture to guess that you are a noble caster.
Noble wizard?
An imperial arcanist.
Dame Verilyn looked up from her coins.
Oh,
that does have a very nice ring to it.
No, I mean that's what they're called. Have you read Fundamental Principles of Magocratic Governance?
I have, but you'll come to learn that frost dragons do not learn in the same manner that humans do.
I do recall Imperial Arcanist being repeatedly mentioned in the text, however. That's what I'm referring to.
Nemel reached up and stretched.
Volume 3 of the treatise deals with the formation of a true magocratic culture. Lady Freyan calls for the transformation of the imperial nobility into an elite cadre of aristocratic mages who will help realize our nation's destiny, imperial arcanists. She tries really hard to make it attractive to her readers, but since cold practicality is promoted over stuff like arts and culture, I think most don't give it any serious consideration.
I assume you see things differently.
It's my favorite volume, Nemel nodded.
Everything just made sense to me. It's what House Gran has been doing since forever.
Reading Lady Freyan's thoughts on it made me realize that there's probably a lot more to our traditions than anyone thinks.
Dame Verilyn continued to stack coins.
Nemel swung her legs out over the edge of the bed and changed into her uniform. After lacing up her boots and using clean from a trooper's towel, she tied up her hair and walked over to join Dame Verilyn at the table.
Did you bring this up for me?
In front of an empty chair was a bowl of creamy potato stew with 2 rolls of fresh bread and butter.
Zushiru had one of his apprentices bring you some breakfast up from the tavern.
He noted how much you seemed to enjoy this back in Ingelford.
I see. She sat down and stirred the hearty stew, savoring the aroma that wafted up at her.
What is Master Shiru's relationship to you, if I may ask?
He is a Quagga, and I am a frost dragon.
Up until recently, the Quagga of the Azalizia Mountains were slaves to the frost dragons.
Nemel's stirring stopped. She stared over at Dame Verilyn. Slaves?
I suppose humans have a different take on that concept. Slavery is not illegal in the Empire, do you have any?
No, Nemel shook her head.
Slaves are expensive and House Gran isn't very wealthy. We're just ordinary nobles who employ a small household and some skilled laborers for our business. Most of them come from families that have been our vassals for generations. Everyone has to work to keep things going.
Is that so?
Dame Verilyn produced another coin pouch. By human definition, the Quagga weren't our slaves, but tributaries. The relationship is much like what the Green Dragon in the Blister has with the cities surrounding it. We occasionally received tribute in the form of precious ores or gems while the Quagga enjoyed a form of protection against powerful threats. They could also pay us to take care of some specific problem. Otherwise, they were free to do as they pleased, just as these humans here are. The Quagga were doing quite well for themselves, until the Sorcerer King appeared and decided to favor the dwarves. After casting a spell to heat her food, Nemel settled in to enjoy her meal. A spoonful of the chunky stew almost reached her lips before she set it back down again.
Is something the matter? Dame Verilyn asked.
I was wondering if there was any poison. Nemel peered at the meal suspiciously. Not that I think Zushiru would poison me, but someone along the way might have put something in here. Are you often the subject of poisoning attempts?
I don't think I've ever been.
With all of those people around, though, I can't help but think about it. They don't even have to kill me, just incapacitate me and try to worm their way close to you while I'm, occupied.
You don't have to worry about that, Dame Verilyn told her.
I have a spell song that can strip away those sorts of detrimental effects.
Nemel shoveled a spoonful of stew into her mouth.
What she knew of bards and spell songs was limited to hearsay and rumors. It wasn't out of any sort of specific negligence on her part, however. The Imperial Magic Academy mainly promoted arcane magic and practical fields. The arts were way on the opposite end of the spectrum and an imperial aristocrat's education, while cultivating an appreciation for fine things, did not provide a real understanding of them. She doubted that even the Emperor himself knew much about spell songs.
I didn't know spell songs could do that, she said between mouthfuls.
I know it's something like a skill that can be employed to produce supernatural effects, but it doesn't sound like a regular skill. You turn music into something like magic, but that just feels so undefined and irrational to a wizard like me.
Imperial Arcanist, you mean?
Nemel smiled despite herself. Lady Freyanne was acquainted with her through an old friend at the academy, but the difference in station between them made any real friendship impossible. The idea that she might be a living example of the genius valedictorian's treatise made her feel a bit closer to her. The composition of spell songs is a product of intuition, Dame Verilyn said, which does sound like it would be frustrating to wizards. As dragons are something like innate sorcerers, however, I feel that I am also naturally inclined towards being a bard.
That makes sense, Nemel agreed, then frowned. Or does it?
Most bards are just bards and not also sorcerers. Arcane magic, no, tier magic doesn't seem to be related to spell songs at all. Tier magic is as different from spell songs as it is to martial arts, except in different directions, if that makes any sense.
She dug into her meal before it grew cold again.
Dame Verilyn continued stacking coins. She emptied the third and final pouch before Nemel finished breakfast. What are all those coins, anyway? Nemel leaned back in her seat. Did Zusharu do a lot of business in the tavern yesterday?
No, he does his own accounting, Dame Verilyn replied. This is from the work I did last night.
Nemel eyed the stacks of gold coins, then she eyed Dame Verilyn's beautiful elven figure. She wouldn't be surprised if she could earn even more than that. No, what was she thinking?
What sort of work did you do? Nemel asked.
Jobs for the local adventurer guild, Dame Verilyn answered. There were 3 commissions conveniently close to one another.
A dragon adventurer. And a knight.
And an agent for the sorceress kingdom. And a prodigious bard who composed her own spell songs. Was there anything that she wasn't? She may as well be a protagonist from Dreams of Red. What were the requests about? They all asked for the removal of one problem or the other. Dame Verilyn pointed to an empty bag. This one was for a giant purple worm in a swamp to the southeast. It will probably be the biggest earner, but we'll see what everything comes out to after the merchant guild dismantles the corpse and sells everything. The alchemists were particularly ecstatic since its blood can be used to brew high-quality antidotes to meet the current shortages. Giant purple worms were magical beasts that measured over 30 meters long. Not only was the blood used for alchemy, but they had potent venom used by rogues and rangers and hides that could be fashioned into leather equipment with roughly the protection of chainmail. Nemel wasn't sure what the other parts of it could be used for, but tradespeople usually made the most out of powerful creatures. Not only had Dame Verilyn been paid to kill it, but the kill itself was extraordinarily valuable. If it were a regular adventurer party that had accepted the commission, a great deal of money would have been spent to prepare everything that was needed to face a giant purple worm, and multiple attempts might be required. After the kill, there would be costs for the treatment of injuries, ailments, and repairs for damaged equipment. Dame Verilyn was so strong that she might have not incurred any costs at all, turning the venture into pure profit. Dragons were always associated with hoards of treasure. Maybe some just earned it by killing stupidly powerful things and selling the parts. What were the other 2 jobs? This one was for a druidic circle in the small forest to the southeast. Dame Verilyn indicated another bag. They were defending the last vestiges of the great forest that once covered the lands between here, Winter, and Ingelfort from encroaching development. There were about 60 of them, but they were spread out around the forest and easy to pick off. Nemel's mouth fell open in horror. That's evil. It was a commission from the Imperial Administration, Dame Verilyn said. The same Imperial Administration that you once served. Maybe that's another reason why they keep adventurers and workers around. They will be attributed to the results of these commissions, and the Empire gets to keep its image clean in the eyes of its citizens. Anyhow, the last job was for a family of hill giants. To the southeast. I did say they were conveniently close to each other. Those weren't the ones that you scented on the way here, were they? They were. There are plenty of giants in the world, but they're nowhere near as prolific as weaker races. Given the extent of human development in the region, I would say that the area in and around the forest was what little remained of their original territory. The lack of apparent conflict between themselves and the forest's residents suggests that they were working together with the Druidic Circle from the other commission to defend it. A wave of anger flashed through Nemel. She found herself standing abruptly to pace around the room. I can't believe you. She fumed. What happened to everything we talked about before? Was it all a lie? I wouldn't lie about something like that. Then why did you do it? The Druids, The hill giants, what about killing them is in line with anything that you've shared with me. They were dead anyway. Nemel stopped to level a glare at the frost dragon seated behind her stacks of coins. How? Because the Empire wanted them dead, Dame Verilyn shrugged. That is what adventurer guild commissions of this nature are, yes? Assassination contracts. If not me, it would have been some other suitably powerful adventurer or combination thereof. If not an adventurer or worker team, the Empire would eventually deploy the undead forces currently being delivered to them by the Sorceress Kingdom. The result was inevitable. I just happened to be the one to take what they were offering to do the deed. Dame Verilyn rose to her feet, sweeping the gold coins into her magical container. It is just as I said, human simplicity. The vast majority of humans here divide the world between what they can control and what they believe they cannot. The Baharuth Empire is no different in this regard. I have watched that forest slowly dwindle from my home in the mountains for over a century. I didn't know why it kept shrinking back then, but I do now. It was a resource to be exploited and its inhabitants were an obstacle to human development. This nation has employed the means at its disposal to address its problem. The Empire has finally succeeded in ridding the forest of the last of its staunchest defenders, and the thousands of inhabitants who depended on their protection will be driven from their homes by the Imperial Army, captured as slaves, or exterminated outright. Once the Empire is done, all that will remain of that ancient woodland are pockets of human-managed copses amidst an expanse of farms for retired soldiers. Beaten into helpless frustration by Dame Verilyn's words, Nemel sniffed and scrubbed her tear-stained cheeks with a hand. I am pleased that you have purged yourself of this unhealthy worldview, Nemel Gran. Dame Verilyn strode towards the door. Your new frame of mind will be of immense assistance to you in the Sorcerer's Kingdom. They're getting braver. They are. Dame Verilyn's stalkers latched onto them the moment they left the Merchant Inn, and Nemel's sense of alarm swept aside the muddled feelings from their discussion over breakfast. Nemel only noticed a handful tailing them from a distance, which meant that there were probably twice that many observing them who were too inconspicuous for her to detect. No one approached as she and Dame Verilyn strolled around the city, but those that she saw seemed to have sorted themselves out and were now more focused on their main task than one another. The overcast skies started to break up as midday approached, allowing the sun to intermittently peek through the clouds. Though Nemel's equipment bestowed protection against the conditions that aerial mages were usually exposed to, she appreciated the warmth nonetheless. As they continued on their way, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather seeped through her when she saw where they were headed. We're going there for lunch again? I was asked to, Dame Verilyn replied. Beyond that, the food quality holds to a high standard. Most importantly, the owners of these bakeries will be reimbursing me for any purchases I make on this trip, so it's basically free food. There are also no lines to get stuck behind. Nemel cast a dubious look up at the undead mascot on the bakery's sign. It undeniably had an impact, but who went around calling their shop Death Bread? The man at the counter immediately brightened upon their approach. Welcome, he smiled. How may I serve you? The bakery at Angelfort had some wonderful meat pies. Do you make them here, as well? Indeed we do, madam, the shopkeeper nodded. What would be your pleasure? Is there anything made from the local game? Dame Verilyn asked. If so, I'll have 6 of those. Also, you fancied the wild berry obstort the last time, didn't you, Officer Gran? Yes, that's right. Then one of those, too, Dame Verilyn told the shopkeeper. Pack 5 of those meat pies away, please. They waited in silence while the shopkeeper put together the order. Nemel examined the food on display. It was, for the most part, what one could find at any respectable bakery in the Empire. The only difference was what was in it, or rather, where what was in it was from. Her gaze traveled away from the displays, going to the wall above the counter. A recently carved plaque with the symbol of the Bakers Guild was mounted on the wall. Don't the guilds test their masters' products before recognizing them? They do, the shopkeeper's lip twitched. The master baker provided them with a sampling of our fare. It took them 2 weeks to render their judgment. Nemel wrinkled her nose. They ate 2-week-old meat pies? They did. Fortunately, the owners had the foresight to issue us preservation containers. Those inspectors had to eat everything eventually. Still, even with guild membership, business is as you see. Membership with a craft guild was a guarantee that the establishment met the standards of that guild. Under normal circumstances, people gave goods of a shop that bore a guild emblem the benefit of the doubt. The shopkeeper placed their order on the counter. Dame Verilyn handed Nemel her share. Together, they started eating in front of the store. "I really appreciate it," the shopkeeper said. "It's perfectly good food, but the people here are still scared to death of it." "Maybe it's the sign," Nemel muttered. "It'll be a great laugh once people get over themselves." "So no one else buys food here?" Nemel asked. "People who can afford to eat elsewhere," the shopkeeper answered. "Those less fortunate come around late at night or before dawn so they aren't seen. Well, there was one lady who came by yesterday evening, an adamantite adventurer from out of town. She wasn't scared of our stuff at all. Ordered a lot, too." Nemel looked out towards the street, glancing at Dame Verilyn out of the corner of her eye. "Just how many meat pies have you eaten since we arrived?" For her part, Dame Verilyn displayed no visible reaction to the man's account. Nemel turned her attention back to the shopkeeper. "Will the shop be able to hold through until things start to change?" "We've got no worries about that," the shopkeeper said. "The owners said they'll back us for as long as it takes." "Well, we don't have much in the way of losses with how cheap the food and fuel delivered to us is. Once traffic from the Dwarf Kingdom picks up again, things'll be fine since they're perfectly happy to eat produce from the Sorceress Kingdom. It's too bad you came in during their holiday. The mushrooms they export make for some excellent pies." Passers-by eyed them as they ate. A beautiful elf and a noblewoman in an Imperial Air Service uniform, eating food that no one else dared to openly. An adamantite adventurer, too. Nemel wondered what sort of effect they would have on the shop's business. Dame Verilyn licked her fingers clean and wiped them on a trooper's towel. Nemel nibbled on her obstort as they strolled back in the direction from where they came. "So will these fellows finally approach us this afternoon?" Dame Verilyn asked. "I'm not sure," Nemel answered. "When it comes to stuff like this, people prefer negotiating in less public settings. Master Shrew always sets up his stand in the southern plaza. They're not going to make any aggressive overtures in the plain view and hearing of hundreds of people. Does being seen and heard by strangers matter when it comes to what they want?" "It can," Nemel replied. "There are dozens of big factions in the Empire and probably thousands of little ones, so there's always the chance that someone nearby is in the pocket of another faction. They're all rivals for influence in different arenas and there's an intricate web of relationships wherever you go. The Emperor removed all major obstacles to his authority and people have kept their heads down since then, so most of what happens is pretty small and local." Nemel put the remaining half of her obstort away to save for later. Over lunch, the skies had cleared completely, offering an unobscured view of the Azalisia Mountains. The frozen peaks gleamed in the midday sun over foothills laced with fresh snow. "Small and local." Dame Verilyn's tone was curious. "Do you have any examples of these factions' activities?" "Honestly, it's pretty normal and it's usually not bad. People push for influence, craft guilds use it to secure rights and better rates for their members, nobles and other wealthy interests might use it to promote business, help make expansion easier, or secure contracts for resources and labor. The problem is when it starts getting bigger or more aggressive." "And this is still small and local?" "Yes," Nemel nodded. "In short, influence can be used to alter the economic and political battlefield and remove the competition. Businesses can be forced under because rivals holding a superior negotiating position will outcompete them. A noble house or faction can slowly take over the economy of a city if its members are skilled enough and its rivals aren't. Once they do that, they essentially hold the linchpin to an entire county or march and then they'll shift their attention towards the rural fiefs in the territory." For the first time in Nemel's recollection, Dame Verilyn cast a lingering gaze westwards towards the towering peaks. "My father was doing something similar, I think. He consolidated power by gathering his family, biding his time until we were strong enough to wipe out our rivals. Or maybe that's not quite the same. I suppose we were considered war potential rather than this political and economic power you humans invest so much into." "In the old days," Nemel said, "powerful nobles could do that. That's actually how we split from Ria's ties. The Imperial Army was established early in the Empire's history, so, after that point, it became political and economic, as you say. I guess what I'm describing is how human factions rise to power when open warfare isn't an option, They gain influence over urban centers and their surrounding territories. At the point when competition becomes too stiff for legitimate means to gain any ground, things can get really dirty. Rivals can be implicated in crimes or otherwise set up to fall out of imperial favor, and the court council will purge them. This just repeats itself until the entire area is in line with the faction that presides over it. The emperor doesn't do anything against this influence over his new appointments. How do I put it? It's not something you can target. It's more like a set of economic and political realities that slowly shift over time. The newly promoted bureaucrats are especially vulnerable. They don't have the skills or awareness to realize that their new titles are in a place that already works in the presiding faction's favor. The conditions they find their new fiefs in aren't ruinous, so they more often than not just do their best within the boundaries that have been set for them under the assumption that things are normal. That's the problem when you have a pure bureaucrat in office. They tend to only see numbers and the technical side of things. Unless they start learning how real nobles do things, they remain oblivious. Nemel's parents considered such new bloods excellent examples as to why their family's traditions and aristocratic education held an advantage over the cold bureaucracy that the empire tended to promote. The rules that dictated imperial politics gave true nobles an undeniable edge against all of the talented individuals promoted in the wake of the bloody emperor's actions. Her family's overall strategy was to use their training and skill as nobles to defend themselves from the machinations of other nobles while remaining absolutely loyal to the imperial house. Its success was in no small part due to the fact that House Grant's main incomes came from their involvement in the magic item industry, which hinged directly on the main branch of the family and vassals whose families had been with them for as long as anyone could remember. Loyalty was their best defense, but many dismissed it as a weakness. Exerting pressure against House Gran was extremely difficult without being overly disruptive and thus drawing the eye of the court council. No one dared to risk that, especially with the current emperor. The reason why Nemel had become caught up in things was that she had stupidly stuck her head out by insisting on a career in the Imperial Army in her whimsical effort to stay connected with her friends and enjoy a bit of personal freedom. As it was often said, everything became clear in hindsight. Nemel no longer had any desire to work in the Imperial Army. Once enlisted, however, the only way for women to be prematurely discharged from military service under honorable conditions was to get married and retire to family life. Men were stuck until they served their terms, which were calculated according to the resources that the empire had invested in their training and future retirement. Alternatively, they could be deemed unfit for service. The Battle of Katza Plains had resulted in roughly 4,000 soldiers retiring due to mental health issues. Fortunately for Nemel, an unprecedented alternative had appeared in the form of Dame Verilin's desire for vassals to help manage her land. "The way you make it sound," Dame Verilin said. "Some people will eventually become so powerful that they can challenge the emperor." "It's not that easy," Nemel replied. "The emperor is backed by the imperial dynasty, the three ducal houses, their cadet branches, and the imperial harem, the imperial army, the imperial ministry of magic and the imperial magic academy. That's pretty much half of the empire's wealth, all of its military might, and the institution that directs the future of the empire's leadership. Also, one can only rise so far before they risk the wrong sort of attention. If the emperor doesn't like the way that someone is sticking out, they'll be set up to fall and the cycle starts all over again." This was what Nemel's father considered the most insidious aspect of it all, a systematic sterilization of the empire's civilian aristocracy. Every noble attainted was generations of tradition specific to that lineage destroyed, replaced by something cold and empty. As a result, the empire as a whole was diminished. He even went so far as to privately say that the imperial dynasty was slowly killing off a part of the soul of the empire. The traditions of the martial nobility were carried into the imperial army, but civilian aristocrats had no such recourse to preserve their collective heritage. Since the imperial dynasty was rarely the target of such measures, it felt as if they were slowly rendering the rest of the nobility impotent against the political and economic machinations of the imperial house. When Fundamental Principles of Magocratic Governance was published, he was somewhat mollified as it was written by a duke's daughter and directly proposed to address the issue. "I could make sense of about a quarter of everything that you just said," Dame Verilin told her. "Eh?" Nemel blinked. "But doesn't the Sorceress Kingdom have nobles? You should have at least seen something like this going on. It isn't as if these types of nobles go out of their way to explain every little thing they do," Dame Verilyn shrugged. Also, I have a sense that the sort of thing that you're describing would be terminally idiotic in the Sorceress Kingdom. Nobles like Lady Zaradnik have a mysterious way of seeing straight through people who run afoul of His Majesty's will. Once they are identified, an investigation incorporating mind control would settle the matter. I see. Dame Verilyn had mentioned something about mind control in Ingelfort. It would certainly put an abrupt end to anything of the sort. Since my charming people would be breaking one of your laws or customs or whatever here, Dame Verilyn told her, you'll just have to point these things out to me as we go. Your house excels at defending itself against these activities, yes? I'll do my best. What am I to you, anyway? The vassals of knights don't usually have fiefs, so I'm a bit confused over that. That is a very good question. I don't recall anything existing in the aristocratic hierarchy that matches. How about the default minion dash? It's a reliable classic. I don't think I would be able to live with everyone calling me Minion Gran. Maybe a titled appointment? What else did you have in mind aside from managing farming villages? Dame Verilyn furrowed her brow for a good long while. I admit that my efforts at the whole domain management thing have been dismal. How about you take over all of that? Once you prove your capabilities, of course. Are you sure about that? Don't get too excited, it's a mountain. What about the villages that you mentioned? I said that there was land enough for 10 villages along the riverfront. Oh. Nemel started to mentally tabulate everything she would need to get started. Having land was all well and good, but it sounded like there was no infrastructure or anything beyond the land itself. Nemel had no money or people. Dame Verilyn mentioned something about goblins. How many potatoes would they produce? Could they even grasp the concept of tenancy? Did goblins even farm? If it's too much for you to handle. No, it's fine. Nemel hurriedly answered, I can do it. At least I think I can. I suppose I'm something like a bailiff, or a seneschal? Whatever you like, Dame Verilyn told her. As long as I get my taxes. They stopped in front of their merchant inn, where Dame Verilyn held out the packed-up stack of meat pies. Nemel looked down at them in confusion for a moment before taking them in hand. As Dame Verilyn's follower, wasn't she supposed to be carrying them in the first place? She needed to review what she had learned of being an attendant from her parents and her sister. What's going on now? Nemel asked. I'm going to change, Dame Verilyn said. Deliver these to Zusharu's stand. I will see you there. Nemel walked off towards the southern end of the city, the small basket of meat pies swaying lightly in her grip. The agents who had tailed them all morning appeared to stay behind to watch for Dame Verilyn's reappearance, though she couldn't be absolutely sure that all of them had. Her worries over the possibility mounted until she stopped at the entrance of an alley to cast reinforce armor and shield wall. Though the crowded streets of East Estate strongly deterred such attempts, attacks in broad daylight were not unheard of in imperial cities. Miss Gran? Nemel jumped at a voice drifting out from the alley. Her head snapped over to look towards its source in a panic. It took her a moment to recognize who had spoken. Fendros? The woman brightened at the sound of her name. She came forward, lifting her skirts as her heels tapped over the hardened soil. It really is you. I thought you looked familiar, but I couldn't be sure with that scary uniform. I'm so relieved. I mean, it's good to see you again, Miss Gran. Just Nemel is fine. I can't. Fendros looked down. This isn't the academy. Nemel glanced over her old classmate. She was dressed to impress. Her silken locks of golden hair flowed softly over her shoulders and it looked like she had recently visited a salon. The barest trace of an expensive fragrance lingered in the air. Fendros was one of the prettiest girls in her second-year class, which was saying a lot as the majority of their class was composed of nobles, and now she was out in full battle gear. An uneasy feeling grew in the pit of Nemel's stomach as she took in Fendros' appearance. This isn't something she can afford. Nemel struggled to maintain her neutral smile. Fendros' pastel blue dress was tailored in the latest winter fashions. Its raised skirts revealed shoes and stockings that were well beyond her usual means. A part of Nemel wanted to reach out and hug her old classmate, but the aristocratic training instilled into her dictated that she couldn't. Fendros was one of the attainted. Did your father put you up to this? Nemel asked. Yes. Unable to contain herself at the meek answer, Nemel sighed. Of the attainted, Many prudently took their skills and what remained of their wealth out of the empire, moving out of the country to create new lives for themselves and their families. Others worked desperately to regain the favor of the emperor, or at least try to ensure that their children had every advantage that remained to them to secure their futures. Then there were those who clung to the past, acting as if nothing had changed or things would return to normal somehow. While not as foolish as Mr. Furt, Fenro's father was still in the category of attainted who clung to the vestiges of their former status. He had probably expended a large fraction of his remaining fortune in a desperate gamble to curry favor with the Sorceress Kingdom by throwing his daughter at Frost 19. Fenrose fearfully looked up at Nemel's frustrated expression. It's not that bad, she brushed a lock of golden hair back from her forehead. I've managed to affiliate myself with someone along the way. Who? At her question, Fenrose fell silent. I can't help you if you don't tell me, Nemel said. Fenro's mouth worked silently. Her mask started to crumble, revealing a mixture of hope and doubt. Help me? But you're with one of the factions from the army, aren't you? Do you mean to say that you're proposing an alliance? That was normally what it would mean. Factions often banded together, forming blocs that vied with one another for influence. Fenro's poorly composed reaction showed just how tenuous she thought her position was. They didn't promise you anything at all, did they? No, Fenrose shook her head. But that's how it works most of the time, yes? Even without any stated agreements, it's a chance for me to prove my worth. I had to take it, Miss Gran. Anger simmered within Nemel as her picture of Fenro's circumstances grew clear. Fenrose was a noble in both pedigree and education, so certain things were essentially impossible to resist. Her father had sunk a fortune in his foolishly short-sighted gamble, causing Fenrose to drop out of the academy to enact his wishes out of familial obligation. Fenrose was clever and resourceful, doing what she could to make the best of her unasked-for situation. Her beauty was such that she could easily exert her influence as a mistress, but, unfortunately, her target wasn't even human. Nemel reached out with her free hand, grasping Fenro's shoulder. After everything that had happened, she was sick of what went on in the Empire. A new land awaited where she had the chance to create a far better place. To succeed, however, she needed help. I'm not talking about an alliance, Nemel told her. When I said help you, I meant you. Personally. You're wasted on this stupidity. My Lord Fath, my father's ambitions aside, maneuvering like this is normal, yes? Why do you think it's stupid? Because the Sorceress Kingdom is too powerful and they don't care. Frost 19 is here to perform a certain set of duties and not even the entire Empire can sway them. Everything else is simply a side thing that they may or may not find interesting. Then we should be targeting those side things to earn their favor. She didn't get it. Well, no, she was technically correct, but the side thing was probably beyond her imagination. Hands still on Fenro's shoulder, Nemel pushed her deeper into the alley. Miss Gran, what? Silence. Fenro's eyes widened. Her hand fumbled around at her belt. I know you're in the army now, but I'm not going to hurt you. Nemel released Fenro's shoulder. This is so that no one else can hear what I'm about to say. You're right about there being something that Dame Verilyn might want you for, but you're wrong about where it will lead you. The other woman's panicked breathing slowed. She slipped her dagger back into its sheath, peering at Nemel suspiciously. By offering her a name, Nemel had tempted her with the possibility of learning more valuable information. What do you mean by that? A faction in the Imperial Army might have sent me at first, Nemel told her, but I work for Dame Verilyn now. To be precise, I've become her vassal. You've gone over to the Sorceress Kingdom? Fenrose frowned, but how? And why would you want to do that? It's a nation of Mon. I'm going to slap you if you finish that sentence. Fenrose clamped her mouth shut. I became a vassal for the same reasons anyone becomes a vassal, Nemel said. Dame Verilyn has land and she's looking for people to help manage it. I've been granted some land in a river valley, a barony's worth. Furthermore, Dame Verilyn has appointed me as seneschal of her territory. Seneschal, so that means? That's right. You are a noble, Fenrose. I'm offering you a chance to do what you were raised to do. This isn't some sort of cruel trick, is it? Fenrose asked. Everyone likes making fun of the attainted. Do you think I would do that? Waves of golden hair went back and forth as Fenrose shook her head. Her lips started to tremble. Tears welled up in her eyes and she quietly started to sob. We can be nobles again. I never stopped being a noble, Fendros. Oh, that's Fendros sniffed. I mean, Liz is here too. You remember her from our class, right? She's working for Count Granberg, so I teamed up with her. Is there a place for Liz as well? Her grades at the academy were just as good as mine. It's just me and you so far, so I don't see why not. Dame Verulin's territory is far larger than a regular barony and there's a lot of work to do. Wasn't there a third in your group back at the academy? Ida is still at the academy, Fendros nodded. I can message her about it if you want, Miss Gran. Her family is almost out of money so they couldn't even do this much. Just how many people did they send after Frost 19? The Imperial dynasty is keeping their hands off but every other major faction is here, plus many of the smaller groups. I heard that there's another official from the Sorceress Kingdom due to arrive in this area at the end of the month, so everyone has positioned a sizable portion of their resources in the region. Nemel shook her head wordlessly. If this other official was anything like Dame Verulin, the Empire's factions were playing a game that the other side had no need nor inclination to. Just how much wealth and influence would be squandered by the end of everything? You can let Ida know about it so she doesn't get caught up in anything rash while her parents flail around, Nemel said. I think things will work out, but we still need to receive approval from my new liege. We'll see what happens after that. Yes, Miss Gran, Fendros nodded. What should we do for the time being? Go and get Elise, then change into something normal. We can probably sell all the expensive stuff you were sent here with for a good price in one of the cities on the Strand. The money will come in handy when we go over to the Sorceress Kingdom. The money belongs to our families though. Yes, and they dressed you up and tossed you out here to be eaten. You can treat it as a better investment and provide them with returns once we get things going. Oh, you'll probably want to keep them in the dark about this so they don't try anything dumb. Right. I guess I should find Liz, then. Will you be waiting here? Nemel hefted the basket in her hand. I have to go to the plaza in the southern quarter, she said. You should find us there easily enough. We'll be there, Fendros lowered her head. Thank you so much, Miss Gran. Fendros disappeared back into the alley. Nemel made her way to the southern plaza, wondering if she had gotten ahead of herself. In the end, she decided that it was worth the attempt. A difficult reality that Nemel preferred not to dwell upon awaited young women from attainted houses. Fendros, Elise and Ida didn't deserve to suffer for the mistakes of their parents. They were brought up as proper nobles and had an academy education. They also weren't stupid. Since they were a part of her class, they were enrolled in the magic stream too. That part might not matter too much since the Sorceress Kingdom was a nation ruled by an unfathomably powerful magic caster that probably knew everything there was to know. But Nemel believed that they could at least serve in the basic roles that magic casters tended to fill. Dame Verulin, in her human form, was already at Zusharu's stand by the time she arrived. Officer Gran, she said, you took longer than expected. Were you ambushed along the way? That might not be wrong. My, how terrible. Was it the men who followed you here? Which one should I kill? Perhaps all three? Nemel's eyes widened in shock. Kill? As you are my vassal, you are under my protection, yes? There are many convoluted things about human society, but this part is simple to understand. Displaying dominance is something that naturally comes with having territory. A vision of East Estate being transformed into a pile of rime-coated rubble by Dame Verulin formed in Nemel's imagination. She quickly waved it away. It's all right. Good, even. I'm a bit happy that it happened. Dame Verulin cast a dubious look at her. Well, I won't question your tastes. Just let me know if something undesirable occurs. How did it end up like that? More importantly, would Dame Verulin really kill someone because they laid their hands on one of her vassals? She supposed that it was a simple matter for someone so powerful. Nemel reheated the meat pies and handed them out to Zusharu and his apprentices. She had regained her appetite after speaking with Fendros, so she finished off her obstort before starting her work at the stand. About an hour later, Fendros and Elise showed up in clothes more suited for city streets. Upon spotting her, Elise rushed up to the stand, her bob of brown hair bouncing with her steps. Miss Gran, the tall young woman said tearfully, thank you so much. Liz. Fendros frowned behind her, we're in public. Acquaintances of yours? Dame Verilyn looked over from the center table. They were my classmates from the Imperial Magic Academy, Nemel said. This? A customer came up behind Dame Verilyn, and she turned with a smile to speak with them. Fendros and Elise slipped in behind the sales counter with Nemel, then jumped back when they noticed the Quago under the counter. Hi. The tall woman lifted a leg. Hi. The Quago apprentice covered his head. Nemel reached out and drew Elise away from the table, just in case she tried to stomp on him. What is that? He's a Quagoa, Nemel told them. This merchant stand is owned and operated by Zushiru and his apprentices, or disciples? They speak a bit strangely sometimes, but they're nice people. Elise gazed over at Dame Verilyn. A small crowd had gathered around her. I thought the gorgeous girl speaking to the customers was the owner. She's, something like an assistant. It shouldn't be a surprise that someone like her is doing the marketing, yes? Her two former classmates cast jealous gazes in Dame Verilyn's direction. Nemel wondered if she looked like that when she had first met the Dragon Knight. Officer Gran, Zushiru's voice came from behind her. Who are these young ladies? Master Shiru, Nemel stepped to the side. They're former classmates from the academy. The what? They're acquaintances. This is Fendros. Well, I suppose it would be better to address her as Ray. This is Elise, who goes by Liz. Nemel silently stood by as they exchanged greetings, eyeing Fendros and Elise's awkward behavior. At least they hadn't tried to put magic arrows into his face. Zushiru would like to know why they are standing behind Zushiru's stand. They wanted to come with us, Nemel said. I was hoping that you wouldn't mind. Do humans normally do this? Zushiru asked. Sometimes. Nemel answered, do you think they could work for you while we go around the Empire? Zushiru peered at Fendros and Elise, then raised his head and tiptoed to look out across the market plaza. A clawed hand reached up to idly scratch his chest. Zushiru still cannot tell with humans. Are they considered attractive amongst your people? Oh yes, Nemel nodded. Ray was one of the prettiest girls in the class and Liz is up there too. All young noble women are trained to entertain men and women both. If you say so. Zushiru eyed them again. What else can Liz and Ray do? Nemel exchanged glances with her former classmates. Every family had unique aspects to its education, so she wasn't exactly sure what they had been taught aside from what was normally expected of an aristocratic house's daughters. They were from regular noble stock, so their social graces, eye for value, and sense for politics and intrigue were probably polished far beyond Nemel's. Fendros' gaze went back and forth between Nemel and Zushiru. We originally came here to, well, you know. Attracting clients to this stand is nothing by comparison. We can work together with the girl that's already here, Elise added, to make the stand even more attractive. We're both arcane apprentices too, so. Do we have any spells for this? Several sets of spells were mandatory for students in the Academy's magic stream. There were basic defensive magics, including simple attack spells like Magic Arrow, and utility spells to assist with their studies. Beyond that, they were instructed to settle on their careers before committing resources into learning specialized magics. Thinking about their circumstances caused anger to slowly rise within Nemel again. Even as attainted, they had desperately studied for the slim chance of an honest future in the Empire. That future had been cast aside by their families for a foolish fancy. Before all this happened, Fendros said, I was starting to learn illusion and divination school spells. There are the conjuration spells that I was using to make ends meet, too. Same here, Elise said. I guess we could summon salt? Half of the industries in every city use it, so it shouldn't be difficult to sell. The conversation turned businesslike as they discussed what could be added to Zushiru's inventory. 30 minutes later, they came to a tentative agreement over their employment at the stand. Nemel smiled, imagining a little bit of weight being lifted from Fendros and Elise's shoulders as a semblance of control returned to their tumultuous reality. Perhaps Dame Verilyn wasn't as gentle and kind as Nemel originally thought she was, but it seemed that they could at least live decent lives as the Frost Dragon subjects.